That Movie Nut here with a review for New York, New York, the 1977 musical drama starring Robert De Niro and Liza Minnelli. The story follows two musicians, Jimmy, a saxophonist, and Francine, a lounge singer. After the end of World War II, they meet up in a bar and subsequently become romantically involved, and soon their careers take off on the jazz circuit. Along the way, they have many personality clashes as the two try to vie for their dreams of success, while at the same time trying to keep their relationship working. The casting all around is solid, and while there are plenty of players that people familiar with 70s cinema will recognize, the people to really talk about here are Robert De Niro and Liza Minnelli as Francine and Jimmy. They do great in their respective roles and really play off each other very well, having a lot of great banter between each other that actually was improvised between them, but we'll get more to that later. De Niro plays Jimmy as very cocky but smooth-talking. He can be very upfront and rough at times, but he undeniably has his heart in the right place and is determined to do whatever he wants. Liza, on the other hand, is much more straight-laced and down-to-earth, at least in the beginning, and doesn't go with Jimmy's smooth charms at first. However, after a couple of chance encounters with him, she gradually starts gravitating towards him and becomes more confident in her own right till her own career starts taking off. And Liza is so good. She gives the part heart and emotion, and we really believe her as she struggles to love this repelling yet strangely attractive man, who is so different yet so symbiotic with her. Not to mention the fact that she's a really, really good singer. And that plays into an aspect of the film that I'll get to in a moment with music. However, for first, I have to bring up the design work by Boris Levin. The film very much wants to emulate the musicals of the 1930s and 40s in the great Warner Brothers and MGM tradition. Films like Singing in the Rain, Wizard of Oz, Top Hat, and of course later Technicolor films such as the many Rodgers and Hammerstein films. And on one hand, they really capture the artifice. There's a great scene when Liza and Robert are in the outdoors in a snowy forest, and it looks just like something out of a 40s Technicolor musical. You can tell it's a backdrop with trees painted onto it, but it looks so vivid, so colorful, and so artificial that it just gives it a sense of timelessness and a sense of heightened reality. Not to mention that the characters wear very colorful outfits with a lot of bold textures and colors on them, and Liza gets to sport a number of dresses throughout. On the other hand, there's more down-to-earth locations, mostly in New York itself, that while they don't at glance seem to be like something out of a Technicolor musical, at the very least they feel like streets that you would see in a 1940s film. Sort of reminiscent of films like The Maltese Falcon in a way, the way the streets are shot and designed. They don't quite look like real streets in a city, but more like film streets. Like you could tell that this was obviously on a back lot somewhere, or at least somewhere that was built to specifications. Once again adding to the artifice and strange timelessness of the design work by Levin. And now on to what I had mentioned before, which was the songs by John Kander and Fred Ebb, with additional musical supervision by Ralph Burns. Now, even though I said it was emulating the style of the 40s musicals, this film in and of itself is actually not a musical, but it has about 5 major songs in it, including the titular song, New York, New York, sung by Liza towards the end of the film. And the songs are all solid, great jazz pieces, and the orchestration for the most part is very much built around jazz. You can hear the saxophones, the trumpets. It very much feels like music you would hear in one of these nightclubs, and you can just imagine characters in those trim suits playing on saxophones behind stands with a guy or woman in a fancy outfit singing to a bunch of patrons. It is an absolute joy to listen to, and they add so much energy and passion to the film that helps it even when it's on its lankier, weaker moments. which is what I'm going to talk about now with script. Or to be more precise, lack thereof. This film actually began shooting without a completed script, and most of the dialogue here was improvised by De Niro, Minnelli, and the cast. And for the most part, the dialogue in and of itself is actually quite good. The improv is actually quite good, and you wouldn't normally think of improv as something you associate with dramatic actors or singers like De Niro and Minnelli. You'd think of it more in terms of comedians like Robin Williams. But here it's actually really good, and it doesn't feel like they're just making it up as they go along. It actually has some feel of rehearsal and structure to it. However, this does lend to one of the film's biggest problems. Because most of the dialogue here and most of the scenes are improvised, the film suffers from a lot of dragging. There are times when the scene will just go on, and characters will repeat themselves, and it really wrecks the pacing. Half the time you're just sitting there going, okay, I get what this scene is trying to get across. Can we get to the next scene or the next song? And even though the improv can be quite enjoyable and funny at points, it just starts to wear after a while. Not to mention that, really, only Liza gets much of a character arc or heavily defined personality. De Niro pretty much starts as a smooth yet rough person, and he ends the film as a smooth yet rough person. He doesn't really change or grow as a character, and most of the other characters in the movie, though played by good actors, are disposable. Minnelli is really the only one that gets any sort of development, going from a slight bit of insecurity in the beginning to a full-blown superstar by the end. And while, again, she does pull it off very well, it does raise a couple of questions, and indeed it ultimately hurts the film, because it makes it feel a bit one-sided and not as full-blooded as it ought to be. And that's the best way to describe the film. It's not full-blooded. It's trying to combine two things: musicals and the kind of gritty drama that Scorsese and De Niro were known for back then. Remember, they had just done Mean Streets and Taxi Driver when they were doing New York, New York. And it's very much oil and water to mix something like a musical, which requires a lot of practice and rehearsal, with something like improv, which is instantaneous and on the moment. And it's interesting, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it helps the film. And at times, it almost feels like the film is struggling in and of itself to have an identity. There are times that really lend themselves to some great musical sequences, but it's not quite a musical because really only Liza sings. Yes, De Niro gets a small bit and there's another girl who sings for a while, but it's really Minnelli's show when it comes to the music, so it's not a proper musical, since in musicals more than one person sings. While at the same time it's not gritty or dark enough to be a proper drama, and the heightened production design with the colors and the contrast and the artifice sort of take away from that. It gives the design a set of timelessness, but at times it feels conflicting, the bright polish with the sometimes more adult subject matter of the dialogue and the story. And that in turn plays into what version of this film to watch, because there's the theatrical version and the director's cut, both of which were released on DVD and Blu-ray. Much like Cinema Paradiso, I advise seeing both cuts of the movie, though the director's cut is better for all intents and purposes, because the story, as I said, even though the scenes drag, there in the director's cut there are more scenes that expand upon De Niro and Minnelli's relationship, and De Niro gets a tiny bit more development than he has in the theatrical cut, and the relationship feels a little more well-rounded. Plus, it has arguably the film's greatest asset, which is the Happy Endings dance sequence, which is a full-blown tribute to the great, grand, extravagant dance and music numbers of these classic musicals. Minnelli is solid there, her singing is great, the dancers are great, Levin's design work on the set is just perfect, and it's just so much fun to watch. The music is so energetic and so well composed, and it really transfers to the audience, and it brings the film up so many notches, even when at times it could be very slow. And it's so sad that that got really trimmed down in the theatrical cut. And arguably, if you can find it for cheap enough, is worth the price of the movie. And so, in conclusion, I must give New York, New York a silver star, but a low one. And that goes for either versions, even with the shortened theatrical cut or the extended director's version. It's definitely worth seeing for any cineast or film fan worth their salt. As I said, it's got a number of highlights, the design, the happy endings number, and the music, but in the end, it's very much a failed, if noble, experiment.